They were born to rule, but some were doomed from the start. Across centuries and continents, whispered curses clung to crowns, crumbled dynasties, and haunted bloodlines. A diamond that destroys kings. A whisper that topples empires. A child emperor swallowed by the sea. These aren't just myths, they're warnings. Tonight, we're digging up the 20 royal curses that history couldn't bury. Not one of them has been broken. Welcome to 20 royal curses that actually came true. And remember, power never goes unpunished. Before we dive into the first curse, make sure you subscribe, especially if you like your history with a side of haunting. We drop stories like this every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Also, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manila? 3 a.m. in Texas? We're dying to know who else is up this late. King Tutankhamun's Pharaoh's Curse. In 1922, the world cracked open, or more precisely, a door did. A narrow, dust-choked doorway in the Valley of the Kings, sealed tight for over 3,000 years, gave way under the hand of Howard Carter. Behind it lay the tomb of a boy king who had ruled Egypt for a flicker of time, died young, and been buried with enough gold to blind the 20th century. His name, Tutankhamun, would be remembered longer than any of his conquests because of what happened after he died. It didn't take long. 6 weeks after Carter pried open the first chamber, Lord Carnarvon, the man who funded the excavation, was dead. A mosquito bite on his cheek became infected, then turned septic. Fever, pneumonia, multiple organ failure. The death certificate listed blood poisoning, but the newspapers had a more exotic cause: the curse of the pharaohs. According to some retellings, all the lights in Cairo flickered and died the moment Carnarvon took his last breath. His dog, back in England, allegedly howled and collapsed. This part, by the way, comes entirely from the imagination of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who publicly declared the expedition had been hexed by ancient priests. Let's take a moment to reflect. The creator of Sherlock Holmes thought a supernatural curse made more sense than bacterial infection. That's the level of hysteria we're dealing with. In fairness, the tomb didn't help its own case. Ancient Egyptians were big believers in curses. There are real tombs, real inscriptions that call down death on tomb robbers. Tutankhamun's tomb had no such inscription, but this minor factual issue did not, in any measurable way, dampen public appetite. Within weeks, the curse was front-page news around the world. Then the deaths started piling up. A radiologist who x-rayed the mummy died of a mysterious illness. A member of the excavation team dropped dead in San Francisco. A wealthy visitor who entered the tomb caught pneumonia and never recovered. One man committed suicide. Another threw himself out a window. Don't worry. We'll keep this one clean, he landed metaphorically. By 1929, at least a dozen people tangentially connected to the tomb were dead. This was more than enough for headlines to scream, "The curse is real." Because, as we all know, nothing proves a supernatural vendetta like an above-average number of upper-class men dying in their 52nd during the interwar period. Of course, reality didn't entirely agree. A later study of all 58 people present at the opening of the tomb found that over 80% lived into their 62nd or beyond. Howard Carter himself, the man who literally broke the seal, lived another 17 years and died at 64. The data just didn't hold up. But by then, the story had taken root in the public's imagination, and the truth was politely told to wait outside. It wasn't just newspapers. The idea of a pharaoh's curse infiltrated films, novels, tabloids, postcards, Halloween costumes. The mummy became a monster. Hollywood stepped in, added eyeliner and bandages, and created a whole new horror archetype. An entire century of pop culture was born from one mosquito bite and a public that desperately wanted magic to be real. Still, there are peculiarities. Autopsies of the tomb's contents found fungal spores Aspergillus niger, among others capable of causing fatal lung infections. The tomb had been sealed for millennia, the air inside stagnant and rich with decay. Could it have acted as a petri dish of airborne revenge? It's a theory, at least a naturalistic one, but no less sinister. And then there's the matter of timing. Lord Carnarvon died in March 1923, only a few months after the tomb was opened. Hitler invaded the Soviet Union mere days after another ancient tomb, Tamerlane's, was cracked open in 1941. Coincidence or coordination? There's a certain grim elegance to both ideas. In the end, the curse of Tutankhamun worked not by killing its targets, but by surviving them. The boy king was a political footnote in his own era, his memory erased by his successors. But in death, he became eternal, not through legacy, not through children, but through myth. The mummy didn't rise, but the story did. And maybe that's the real curse. Not that the tomb took lives, but that it refused to give back the truth. The more we study it, the more we find gold, fungus, trauma, propaganda, but never the one thing that satisfies us, a clean answer, a closed case. Instead, what we get is a string of eerie coincidences, packaged in myth, sealed in superstition, and sold as a souvenir. But if you thought Tutankhamun's revenge was neatly timed, wait until you hear what happened when Soviet scientists cracked open the tomb of a 14th century conqueror right before World War II turned to ash. Tamerlane's tomb curse. On a sweltering June morning in 1941, a team of Soviet archaeologists stood over a centuries-old sarcophagus deep in the heart of Uzbekistan. It was the final resting place of Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, a conqueror who had reduced empires to kindling, stacked pyramids of skulls, and burned entire cities off the map. His tomb, carved in jade and inscribed in Persian, had sat undisturbed beneath the Gur-e-Amir mausoleum for over 500 years. And now, someone had the bright idea to open it. This wasn't an Indiana Jones situation. There was no whip, no Nazi standoff, no glittering idol. Just a group of Soviet scientists, a war-weary country, and a mausoleum that looked a little too serene for its reputation. And that's where the problem started, because Tamerlane's tomb, unlike King Tut's time, came with a warning. Two, actually. One inscription, reportedly carved on the inner casket, read, "Whoever opens my tomb shall unleash an invader more terrible than I." Another version, possibly embroidered later, as these things often are warned, "Whosoever disturbs my grave will unleash war and terror." Spooky stuff. The sort of message that would usually give an archaeologist pause, or at least a dramatic voiceover. But this was the Soviet Union. In 1941, Stalin had no patience for ghosts. The expedition went ahead, the tomb was opened, and within 3 days, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history, sending over 3 million troops to break the Soviet Union like a fortune cookie. Now, depending on your appetite for ominous coincidences, this timing either means everything or nothing. After all, Stalin's military planners had been watching the build-up on the German border for months. War was coming, curse or no curse. But try telling that to anyone who lived through it. The myth practically wrote itself. Timur the Lame, the Iron Cripple, had cursed the world with war from beyond the grave. A man who claimed descent from Genghis Khan, who once left Delhi in flames and Baghdad a ruin, had in death unleashed a conqueror even more terrible than himself. It was too perfect, too horrifyingly poetic. Of course, the official Soviet record was less dramatic. The lead anthropologist, Mikhail Gerasimov, was more interested in reconstructing Timur's facial structure than interpreting ominous inscriptions. Gerasimov, to his credit, built a face stoic, severe, slightly asymmetrical from the bones, and declared it a scientific success. But no amount of cranial analysis could explain what happened next. The invasion of the USSR wasn't just a military disaster. It was a biblical-level catastrophe. Entire cities erased, millions dead, a nation broken, glued back together with blood and ration cards. And for many in the Soviet public, especially in Central Asia, where Timur's legacy still loomed large, the timing was unmistakable. They had disturbed a sleeping monster, and the monster had answered. Eventually, Stalin noticed. In 1942, with the war teetering in morale and freefall, Soviet leadership ordered a hasty reversal. Tamerlane's remains were to be returned to Samarkand and reburied with full Islamic rites. Not just scientific reinterment, mind you, religious ceremony, prayers, ritual respect. For a regime that had spent decades erasing religion from public life, it was an extraordinary move. A pragmatic nod to the supernatural. The state didn't believe in curses, but it wasn't taking chances either. And then, because history has a twisted sense of humor, something changed. 2 days after Tamerlane was reburied, the Soviets won the Battle of Stalingrad. The turning point of the war. The moment the tide shifted. The beginning of the end for Hitler's dream of empire. A new myth began to take root. The curse had been lifted. The conqueror had been appeased. The dead, finally, were at rest. Was any of this causal? Number. There's no peer-reviewed study linking corpse exhumation to tank formations, but the narrative symmetry is intoxicating. The pattern recognition engine in the human brain loves nothing more than a story that loops back into itself, and Tamerlane's story does that beautifully. He was a man whose conquests were built on terror and spectacle, whose entire reputation was sculpted from fear. Is it really so surprising that even in death, the aura of threat lingered? He didn't need to rise from the grave. He just needed to remind us he was still down there, watching, waiting, taking offense at Soviet anthropology. And maybe that's the heart of the so-called curse. It wasn't Timur who cursed the world. It was us, for thinking we could open a centuries-old tomb during the most fragile moment in modern history and not get scorched by the poetry of it. Because even when there's no magic, the myth will still punish you. And if you think one dead emperor whispering doom from the afterlife is unsettling, just wait until you meet a Grand Master who died in fire and supposedly took down kings and popes with his final breath. If you've made it this far, you're clearly one of us, the kind who enjoys their history cursed and their nights a little uneasy. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It helps more than you think, and we've got plenty more where this came from. And while we're on the subject of timing, where are you watching from, and what time is it over there? Is it stormy in Scotland? Quiet in Kuala Lumpur? Let us know in the comments. We're building a global map of night owls and mystery seekers. The Templar Grand Master's dying malediction. The 18th of March, 1314. A grey morning in Paris, the kind that makes history feel inevitable. On an island in the Seine, not far from the towers of Notre Dame, a wooden scaffold had been raised. Upon it stood Jacques de Molay, last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, hands bound, eyes level, mouth allegedly already shaping history. He was about to die, not by sword or plague or old age, but by politics. The Templars, those armoured monks of crusading fame, had grown too wealthy, too secretive, and, most importantly, too inconvenient. King Philip IV of France wanted their treasure, Pope Clement V wanted their silence. And so, in one of the most strategic acts of medieval betrayal ever staged, they got both by accusing the Templars of heresy, dissolving the order, and marching its leaders to their deaths. But according to centuries of rumour, Jacques de Molay didn't go quietly. He is said to have turned to the king and the pope as the flames were lit and pronounced a final curse. Pope Clement, King Philip, within a year, I summon you to God's court. A poetic little ultimatum delivered with the clarity of vengeance and the structure of a well-timed prophecy, possibly invented, possibly true, but certainly effective, because that year both men died. Pope Clement died a month later. Philip IV followed just months after that. Natural causes, official records claim. But this was the 14th century. No one believed in natural causes. They believed in omens, in divine judgment, in curses. And the deaths of two of the most powerful men in Christendom, hot on the heels of a Templar's final words, smelled less like coincidence and more like spiritual indictment. The legend bloomed almost immediately. Chroniclers wrote of the Pope's body being too vile to bury, of the king being thrown from his horse and snapping his neck. The actual cause of death is debated. But the real meat of the story came not from how they died, but what happened next. Because death didn't stop the curse, it only warmed it up. Philip IV had 3 sons. Each became king. Each died young. None left a male heir. Within 14 years of de Molay's death, the Capetian line which had ruled France for over 3 centuries was dead. Just extinguished. No sons, no grandsons, no conveniently overlooked cousins. The direct bloodline of France's kings collapsed like a bad lung. And what followed was worse. The 100 Years' War, a dynastic dumpster fire that burned through Europe for over a century, sparked by the power vacuum that the Capetians' extinction created. French history didn't so much take a detour as careen off a cliff and somersault into fire. The idea of the Templar curse became a kind of medieval meme, popular, contagious, impossible to kill. It acquired a name, the Curse of the Accursed Kings, La Malédiction des Rois Maudits, coined centuries later by novelists, but widely embraced by historians, mystics, and conspiracy theorists alike. It suggested that de Molay's death had created a fracture in divine order, a kind of spiritual indictment of monarchy itself. Which, frankly, makes sense. The Templars had once been the sword arm of the Church, a holy order. Their destruction wasn't just political, it was existential. A betrayal by king and pope, not just of men, but of institutions. Maybe de Molay's curse, if it happened at all, wasn't magic. Maybe it was a reckoning. Now, historians, those irritating killjoys, tend to brush aside the curse. They point out that Clement was already sick, that Philip had a stroke, that hereditary lines die out all the time, especially when kings treat marriage alliances like chess pieces and children like contracts. But skeptics can't explain the timing, the poetry of it, or the eerie echo of that last phrase, I summon you to God's court, which feels less like a curse and more like a subpoena. And the further you go down the rabbit hole, the more it echoes. A 14th century heretic dies, and within years the monarchy collapses. Europe ignites. The Templars vanish into legend, then resurface in everything from Freemason origin stories to Dan Brown novels. There's no evidence they had treasure, or secrets, or scrolls. But there's a suspicious amount of silence. Lost records, destroyed archives, vanished artifacts, and behind all of it, the ghost of a man who may have spoken his enemies into the afterlife. Maybe that's the real curse. Not the deaths, but the narrative that refuses to die. A legend so sticky, so seductively structured, that even rational minds feel uneasy, dismissing it. Because the moment you start connecting dots in history, the lines draw themselves. And the line from that Paris scaffold runs straight through popes, kings, and bloodlines, and vanishes into fire. But curses, as we know, don't limit themselves to Europe. And if you thought one whispered threat could take down monarchs and ignite wars, what do you make of a prophecy delivered by a mystic in Tsarist Russia, foretelling the fall of an empire and the deaths of a royal family, just months before it all came true? Rasputin's last prophecy. By the winter of 1916, the Russian Empire was already teetering. The war was going badly. The people were starving. The army was exhausted. And the Tsar Nicholas II was increasingly seen as a tragic relic of a doomed age. But behind the chaos, and buried somewhere between whispered rumors and half-believed newspaper stories, stood a figure so improbable, so wildly out of place in the royal world, that his very existence felt like a glitch in history. Grigory Rasputin, peasant, wanderer, healer, prophet, and, depending on who you asked, a holy man or a walking curse. He was dirty, hypnotic, impossible to ignore. He smelled like fear and cheap incense. And for nearly a decade, he haunted the Russian royal family like a shadow they couldn't explain. The Tsarina, Alexandra, believed he had divine gifts. The nobility believed he was a fraud. The people believed he was sleeping with the Empress. And all three beliefs, in different ways, were incorrect and dangerously true. But of all the legends swirling around Rasputin, the one that refuses to vanish is this. Shortly before his death, he prophesied the fall of the Romanov dynasty. The story goes like this. In a letter, possibly written in December of 1916, Rasputin warned Tsar Nicholas II that he, Rasputin, would be murdered by nobles. And that, if this came to pass, the Romanov family would fall within 2 years. Not just fall politically, but die violently, completely. If I die by the hand of common men, you will reign for centuries to come, he allegedly wrote. But if I am killed by nobles, then none of your family, none of your children will survive. It reads like a biblical curse dressed in orthodox robes. And the timing is inconvenient, because that very month, in the dark corridors of St. Petersburg, a group of noblemen plotted Rasputin's assassination. They believed that removing him would save the monarchy. What they failed to realize was that they were walking straight into the curse he'd already spoken. On the night of the 30th of December, 1916 old style, Rasputin was lured to the palace of Prince Felix Yusupov. What happened next has been mythologized to the point of parody, poison, gunshots, improbable resurrections. The only thing that's certain is that Rasputin died that night, and it was by the hands of nobles. And then history snapped. Just 3 months later, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. The monarchy, which had stood for over 300 years, collapsed. A provisional government briefly took its place, only to be swept away by the Bolsheviks. The Romanovs were placed under house arrest, then relocated, then disappeared into the red fog of revolution. By July of 1918, they were all dead. Nicholas, Alexandra, their daughters, their hemophiliac son, Alexei, every one of them erased. Just as Rasputin said. Historians often try to deconstruct the prophecy. The text survives only in later copies, most likely reconstructed from memory or forged entirely. Rasputin was no saint. He was deeply political, often contradictory, and enjoyed the spotlight too much to be trusted with absolute sincerity. But still, the pattern is hard to shake. He was correct, not just in tone, but in detail. He didn't predict the fall of the monarchy in abstract terms. He tied it to his own death, a kind of bargain with history. If I die like this, then you die like that. It's chilling in its symmetry. And even if you strip the prophecy of its supernatural weight, it becomes no less disturbing. Because Rasputin, in his twisted, debauched way, may have understood something the royal family refused to accept, that the monarchy was already beyond saving. That by letting nobles dictate the fate of their so-called savior, the Romanovs were only proving how little power they truly had left. In that light, the prophecy becomes less a curse and more a final diagnosis. There's also a bitter irony that Rasputin, a man so reviled by the aristocracy, was in some ways more right than all of them. They believed removing him would restore balance. But Rasputin wasn't the disease, he was the symptom. And killing him didn't save the patient. It only silenced the one person crazy enough to name the cause of death in advance. The strangest part is how many Russians, even today, still half believe the curse, not just the prophecy, but the idea that Rasputin had some connection to forces larger than himself. That he wasn't just a mystic or a madman, but a vessel, a warning, a cracked mirror that showed the Romanovs exactly what they didn't want to see. And maybe that's the real reason the curse persists. Because no matter how uncomfortable, it explains something that politics and history books don't paw. It gives the end of the Russian monarchy a sense of eerie design. Not random, not inevitable, but warned and ignored. Of course, the curse didn't die with the Romanovs. It lived on, echoed in jewelry boxes and coronation vaults, especially in one very large diamond, with a reputation for destroying any king foolish enough to wear it, the Koh-i-Noor men's curse. It is, quite possibly, the most famous diamond in the world. Weighing in at over 100 carats in its current form, the Koh-i-Noor is less a gemstone and more a geopolitical pressure point masquerading as jewelry. Its name means Mountain of Light in Persian, but its history, bloody, fractured, and soaked in imperial irony, reads more like a long, slow-motion collapse of empires. And somewhere beneath all that weight and sparkle is a legend, a curse, one aimed specifically at men. The rules of this curse are relatively simple. Any man who wears the Koh-i-Noor will suffer misfortune, downfall, or death. The diamond, however, appears to tolerate queens just fine. That distinction matters, because this is no ordinary jewel. Its known history stretches back over 700 years, possibly more, into the shifting courts of medieval India and Persia, where it passed through the hands of kings, emperors, conquerors, and colonizers, most of whom met grisly or tragic ends. Like a jewel that quietly hates power, it has an uncanny knack for outlasting those who wear it. The curse, according to oral tradition, was either born with the stone or acquired somewhere along the way. One popular saying, attributed to a Persian chronicler, declares, "He who owns this diamond will own the world, but will also know all its misfortunes." A poetic way of saying, sure, you can have this shiny piece of forever, but the bill will come due. And it did, repeatedly. The diamond was allegedly once set into the Mughal peacock throne in India, a monument of excess that made Versailles look like a modest Airbnb. It survived the fall of the Mughal Empire. Then it was taken by Persian invader Nader Shah in 1739, who was assassinated shortly afterward. From there, it bounced through dynasties like a pinball, attached to downfall after downfall. In 1849, at the end of the Second Anglo-Sikh War, the British East India Company annexed the Punjab region and acquired the Koh-i-Noor from the 10-year-old Maharaja Duleep Singh, effectively making it war loot. It was sent to Queen Victoria, recut, polished down to a glinting Western ideal, and set into the British crown jewels. That's when the curse became selective. Since arriving in Britain, the Koh-i-Noor has only ever been worn by female royals, first Queen Victoria, then Queen Alexandra, Queen Mary, and Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother. When it came time for King Charles III's coronation in 2023, the diamond was conspicuously absent. Officially, it was out of rotation. Unofficially, the royal family didn't want to tempt fate or controversy. Because here's the problem, the curse might be legend, but the optics are very real. Almost every man who claimed the diamond met some variety of ruin. Not just death, but the slow unraveling of power. Military defeat, betrayal, exile, loss of legacy. For an object supposedly symbolizing imperial permanence, the Koh-i-Noor has a habit of turning dynasties into footnotes. That's why, even today, it's treated less like a crown jewel and more like a diplomatic grenade. India wants it back. So does Pakistan. So does Iran. Afghanistan has laid claim too. No one agrees on who deserves it, but everyone agrees it doesn't belong where it currently sits in a locked glass case inside the Tower of London, exuding enough bad vibes to power an entire season of historical drama. But what's fascinating isn't just the superstition, it's how the British monarchy reacted to it. Rather than ignore the curse, they adjusted, subtly, strategically. The Koh-i-Noor has never been worn by a king, despite being in royal hands for nearly 2 centuries. Even the most tradition-bound institution on earth took one look at its track record and decided, maybe let the ladies handle this one. There's something almost mythically strategic about that, as if the diamond itself negotiated its own terms. You can keep me, it seems to say, but I choose who wears me. And so it sits visible but untouchable, a relic of conquest disguised as heritage, a stone that reflects not just light, but power, guilt, and a long list of fallen men. Now, skeptics would point out that plenty of men have held the diamond without incident, that monarchies fall for many reasons, that the curse is a romantic narrative painted over the hard facts of empire, theft, and political collapse. And all that might be true. But then again, no British king has dared to wear it. That caution, that quiet superstition, built into royal protocol, speaks louder than any myth. The Koh-i-Noor didn't need to kill anyone to prove its point, it just needed to leave behind a pattern, one so unmistakable that even monarchs began listening to the silence. And if you think one cursed diamond can fracture royal bloodlines and terrify coronation committees, consider what happens when the curse doesn't just follow a jewel, but an entire family. A family that rules by birthright, yet seems incapable of holding on to love. The Grimaldi marital curse. Once upon a Mediterranean coastline, nestled between the cliffside glamour of Nice and the edge of Italian ambition, lies a postcard-sized principality that shouldn't exist, Monaco. A monarchy too small to rule over more than a few square kilometers of land, and yet, paradoxically, too famous to ignore. A place where billionaires park their yachts like sedans, and where the royal family is more often photographed in tabloids than in state ceremonies. But behind the champagne flutes and diamond tiaras, there's a story that isn't as glossy. It involves heartbreak, misfortune, scandals in every direction. And, of course, a curse one that has allegedly haunted the ruling Grimaldi family for over 7 centuries. The legend dates back to the 13th century, when the Grimaldis, then a Genoese noble family, were expanding their control along the Ligurian coast. According to the version repeated in quiet corners of Monaco's old town, a Grimaldi nobleman, exact identity optional, wronged a local woman. In some retellings, she was a witch. In others, a healer. Either way, she was furious. And fury, when paired with prophecy, always lands better in folklore. Her words? Something along the lines of, "Never shall a Grimaldi find happiness in marriage." It's not Shakespeare, but it's stuck. The Grimaldis took Monaco in 1297 through subterfuge and swordplay. They ruled through wars, revolutions, occupations, and upheaval. But through it all, their private lives were remarkably consistent for their disaster rate. Loveless unions, bitter separations, and whisper-riddled affairs seemed to follow generation after generation like clockwork. Take Prince Rainier III, perhaps the most globally recognizable Grimaldi until recently. His marriage to Grace Kelly, Hollywood royalty turned actual royalty, was the stuff of cinematic perfection. The beautiful American actress and the European prince. What could possibly go wrong? Plenty. Despite their photogenic appearances and worldwide acclaim, their relationship, according to numerous biographers and friends, was far more complicated behind palace walls. Grace gave up her film career, endured intense scrutiny from both press and protocol, and lived a life that, while glamorous in theory, was suffocating in practice. Rainier, for his part, struggled with the burden of maintaining Monaco's sovereignty, modernizing its economy, and, allegedly, managing a temper. Grace died tragically in 1982 after losing control of her car on a winding mountain road, a loss that sent both her family and the public into mourning. Her daughter, Princess Stephanie, was in the car with her and survived only to face a string of high-profile, chaotic relationships of her own. A pattern, you might say, repeating. And then there's Princess Caroline, the eldest daughter, whose first husband died in a tragic accident, and whose second marriage to Prince Ernst August of Hanover became tabloid fodder for reasons that were equal parts personal and diplomatic. Her royal titles have never protected her from heartbreak, but the most glaring modern chapter in this long saga of romantic misfortune belongs to Prince Albert II, Rainier and Grace's only son, and Monaco's current sovereign. Albert waited until age 53 to marry, which in monarchic terms is practically a rebellion. His bride, South African Olympian Charlene Wittstock, was elegant, athletic, and composed Monaco's answer to rebooting its royal image for a global audience. The wedding in 2011 was grand, lavish, televised, and blessed by every major institution with a camera. And yet, something felt off. Rumours swirled almost immediately. Reports emerged that Charlene had tried to flee Monaco before the wedding and that palace officials had taken steps to prevent her departure. Those accounts remain officially denied, but the speculation has never really gone away. Since then, Charlene has spent long stretches away from Monaco for various health reasons, and public appearances with her husband have often seemed distant, strained, or oddly choreographed. Even the most ardent royal watchers struggle to paint their union as one of unshakable harmony. To outside observers, it's tempting to brush all of this off as the usual turbulence of modern royalty after all. Public figures are allowed unhappy marriages. But to locals, the legend still lingers. The Grimaldis, no matter how rich, photogenic, or powerful, seem incapable of finding peace in love. It's a strange kind of curse. Not fatal, not supernatural in the usual fire and brimstone sense, but deeply human, emotionally corrosive. A curse that doesn't kill, but corrodes slowly. Dignity, intimacy, trust eroded not by age, but by something deeper, something inherited. Because in Monaco, where pageantry is perpetual and privacy a luxury even royals can't afford, emotional unraveling happens in public, under lights, through lenses. The curse isn't just about bad marriages, it's about the way those marriages are devoured by spectacle. And maybe, just maybe, the old woman's curse wasn't supernatural at all. Maybe it was a mirror held up to the Grimaldas by someone who saw what power does to love and how love, when chained to legacy, eventually starts to rot. But the most chilling part, this curse isn't even the most ancient one on our list. Because centuries before the Grimaldises' ill-fated romances, a queen in South India whispered her final words before drowning words that would doom a royal line, a village, and the very earth itself. Alam Elama's Curse on the Wadiyars. In the 17th century, southern India was a landscape of splintered kingdoms, whispered prophecies, and shifting allegiances where royal power was as much about who you prayed to as who you conquered. And, nestled in the river-wrapped region of Mysore, a curse took root so deeply that even now, 400 years later, it's discussed not with irony, but with caution. The curse came from a woman named Alamelama. She wasn't a queen or a general. She wasn't born into power. But through her, an entire royal dynasty, the Wadiyars became bound to 3 eerily specific and stubbornly persistent afflictions. The story begins in the early 1602, when the Wadiyars were a rising power in Karnataka. Back then, they served under the Vijayanagara Empire until they decided they were done serving. In 1610, Raja Wadiyar seized control of the region of Srirangapatna, ousting the local governor, Tirumala, who, incidentally, was married to a woman named Alamelamama. Alamelama was, by all accounts, pious, educated, and fiercely devoted to the goddess Ranganayaki, to whom she donated her jewellery weekly as a ritual offering. When Raja Wadiyar took Srirangapatna, he wanted the same divine legitimacy, which, apparently, meant acquiring Alamelama's jewels. Whether it was for religious continuity or royal greed is open to interpretation, but either way, the messengers came. She refused. What happened next is a blend of legend and selective record-keeping. Faced with increasing pressure and perhaps fearing arrest or humiliation, Alamelama fled. Pursued to the banks of the Kaveri River, she is said to have stood at the edge of a cliff, clutched her remaining jewellery, and uttered a curse before disappearing, whether by choice or force remains unclear. Her final words were chillingly precise. Let Talakadu become a barren land of sand. Let Malangi turn into a whirlpool. Let the Wadiyars of Mysore fail to bear children. And that was that. 1 curse, 3 targets, a city, a river, and a royal line. Let's break that down. First, Talakadu. Once a vibrant temple town on the banks of the Kaveri, Talakadu was known for its fertility, both agricultural and spiritual. But not long after the curse, it began to change. Sand started to creep in. Not just silt or flood sediment, but massive dunes, swallowing temples whole. Today, over 30 temples in Talakadu lie buried beneath sand mounds that stretch across the landscape like miniature deserts. Scientists have proposed geological explanations: river course shifts, deforestation, wind erosion. Fair points. But locals still point to Alamelama. After all, dunes don't just appear in a town built on riverbanks. Second, Malangi. Downstream from Talakadu, the Kaveri narrows. Here, in the shadow of quiet forests, the water turns dangerous. Deep eddies, silent whirlpools. Malangi became notorious for pulling in swimmers, livestock, even boats, a place so beautiful you forget to be afraid until you vanish. Again, geologists talk about riverbed topography. Locals talk about curses. In either case, Malangi became exactly what Alamelama said it would: a death trap made of water. Third, the Wadiyars. Now we reach the strangest part. After Alamelama's death, the Wadiyars went on to rule Mysore for centuries. They were successful, modernizing the state, commissioning palaces, supporting the arts. But their family tree? Always brittle. For generation after generation, the Wadiyars suffered a mysterious pattern, an absence of direct male heirs. Over and over, kings adopted sons, nephews, cousins, distant relatives to continue the line. Biographers often refer to the curse only in passing, but palace records reveal an undeniable pattern of adoption after adoption. Even in the 20th century, Jayachamarajendra Wadiyar, the last reigning Maharaja before Indian independence, adopted a son in 1953 once again, bypassing biology. Now, infertility has many explanations: medical, psychological, social. But when it happens for 400 years straight, to the same royal family, under the shadow of a specific curse, people notice. The Wadiyars, to their credit, never mocked the legend. In fact, they embraced it. They began making regular offerings to the spirit of Alamelama, constructing a temple in her honor, conducting rituals, publicly acknowledging her wrath. Every year, they observe a ceremony called Alamelama's Aradhana, where her memory is not erased, but appeased. It's a rare case of a curse becoming institutionalized, not as shame, but as tradition. And perhaps that's why the curse persists, because it was never simply about vengeance. It was about power. The power of the marginalized to leave a mark so deep that even palaces must bow to it. Alamelama didn't have armies. She didn't have land. What she had was a final word, and somehow that was enough. Today, Talakadu still shifts under the sand. Malangi still swirls. The Wadiyar dynasty, though now symbolic, still acknowledges the woman who once defied them. And in a country filled with myths, this one feels oddly symmetrical. A queen in exile, a curse with receipts, and a royal house too proud to ignore it. But while Alamelama's words reshaped a kingdom's fate, another ruler's curse didn't just affect people it killed, quietly and biologically, with a fungal vengeance that science still hesitates to dismiss entirely. King Casimir IV's biological bomb. In 1973, a team of Polish archaeologists and medical researchers gathered inside a medieval cathedral in Kraków. Their objective? To open the tomb of King Casimir IV, Jagiellon, a 15th century ruler who had once commanded one of the largest political unions in Europe. His reign was long, his influence vast, and his burial suitably majestic, sealed inside a grand sarcophagus in the Wawel Cathedral, a Gothic stronghold of Polish kings and saints. The tomb had remained untouched for nearly 500 years, and when the team finally pried it open, they found exactly what they were looking for: the mummified remains of the king, lavishly wrapped, serenely still. But they also found something else, something that no one had prepared for. Within weeks of opening Casimir's tomb, 4 of the 12 researchers were dead. Others fell gravely ill. There were no obvious signs of trauma. No curses inscribed on the walls. No ancient warnings in Latin to beware all who enter. But the deaths were real, sudden, unexplained. And so, of course, the legend was born. The king had cursed his own corpse. The idea wasn't new. Poland, like much of Eastern Europe, has a long and intimate relationship with the mystical, the sacred, and the faintly ominous. Cursed graves and restless dead are woven deep into local folklore. But this was something different. This was modern, documented, medical. Casimir IV had ruled from 1447 to 1492, a pivotal moment in Europe's history. He led the Polish-Lithuanian Union through wars, reforms, and diplomatic expansions. His rule, while marked by the usual medieval combination of ambition and instability, was considered a golden age. And when he died, he was buried with all the pomp of a king who had earned rest. But rest, as it turned out, was not what he offered in return. So what actually happened? Initially, doctors were baffled. The researchers had not been exposed to radiation, no toxins, no visible infections, just a sudden onset of respiratory failure, fever, and eventually death. It wasn't until later studies that a quieter, more insidious explanation began to emerge: a fungal pathogen. Specifically, Aspergillus flavus, a strain of mold known for producing aflatoxins, highly toxic, even carcinogenic compounds. Under normal conditions, this fungus is harmless to most people. But when inhaled in sufficient quantities, especially in enclosed, oxygen-starved environments like a 500-year-old royal tomb, it can cause severe respiratory illness, organ damage, and in vulnerable individuals, death. In other words, Casimir's curse might have been biological. This explanation, while less theatrical than ghostly revenge, is somehow even more disturbing. It reframes the entire scene, a royal sarcophagus, not as a resting place, but as a sealed time capsule of microbial death, a bioweapon built by accident, preserved by stone, and triggered by curiosity. It also gives an unsettling dimension to the idea of sacred spaces. The Wawel Cathedral, for centuries, has been a pilgrimage site, a place of reverence. But in that one tomb, what lay dormant wasn't divine, it was deadly, and it had waited, patiently, for science to come knocking. Of course, not everyone accepts the fungal theory. Some believe the deaths were coincidental. After all, 12 researchers entered, and the majority survived. But 4 is still a high toll, especially among trained professionals within a short time span, in the same context. The correlation is hard to ignore, even if the cause isn't wrapped in supernatural fog. But what's most striking is how the story was absorbed. Rather than deny the deaths, the Polish press leaned into the mystery. Headlines used the word curse without flinching. Locals, already familiar with tales of haunted forests and vengeful saints, didn't need convincing. It was as if Casimir had earned in death the one thing he never quite had in life, a reputation for menace. And in some ways, that's the ultimate irony. Casimir IV was not a particularly fearsome king. He was strategic, diplomatic, sometimes indecisive. He brokered alliances, wrote reforms, kept the state intact. No Vlad the Impaler, no Genghis Khan, just a competent ruler who avoided unnecessary cruelty. And yet, centuries later, his name is whispered with unease, not for what he did while living, but for what followed when he was disturbed. The tomb remains sealed today, now handled with the kind of reverence normally reserved for radioactive material. It's not the marble or the gold that people fear, it's the air, the invisible. The ancient microbe that has no interest in politics, but responds to breath and curiosity like clockwork. Which raises a question: when does a curse stop being supernatural? When it's explainable by science, or when the explanation makes you more afraid, not less? Because the most haunting part of Casimir's story isn't the fungal theory. It's the possibility that the dead do, in fact, defend their peace. That some tombs were meant to stay closed not because of ghosts, but because they remember. And if that unsettles you, wait until you hear about a forgotten emperor in Japan who was so thoroughly believed to have cursed the court that his angry ghost became a god, and was worshipped just to keep him from burning the capital to the ground. Emperor Sutoku's Onryo. In the annals of Japanese history, a quiet terror lingers in the spaces where court politics, spiritual vengeance, and folklore collide. It's not always loud. It doesn't announce itself with thunder or blood. Instead, it seeps in like mist under a doorframe. One such terror was Emperor Sutoku, a man who died a monk but lived on as something far less peaceful. An Onryo, a vengeful spirit, and arguably one of the most feared supernatural presences in the history of Japan. His curse, if it can be called that, didn't shout. It simmered, waited, and then unraveled the capital. Let's rewind to the 12th century. Sutoku was born into privilege as the son of Emperor Toba, and like many sons of emperors, he was placed on the chrysanthemum throne while still a child. But being emperor in Heian-era Japan was a ceremonial gig more than a position of actual power. Real authority lay in the hands of cloistered emperors, retired monarchs pulling strings from behind temple walls, and the aristocratic Fujiwara clan, which basically acted as the unofficial government. Sutoku was emperor in name, but not in influence. Then came betrayal. After a series of courtly chess moves and intra-family backstabbing standard fare in Imperial Japan, Sutoku was forced to abdicate in favor of his younger brother. He expected to retain influence as a retired emperor. Instead, he was sidelined completely, denied power, denied status, and eventually accused of plotting rebellion. He was exiled to Sanuki Province on Shikoku Island. There, stripped of titles and surrounded by monks, he faded from public view. Except he didn't fade. In exile, Sutoku reportedly turned to religious texts not for peace, but for revenge. Local legends claim he spent his days copying Buddhist sutras in hopes that they would be accepted by the capital's temples. But when the imperial court learned they came from a man they considered spiritually defiled, perhaps even demonically tainted, they rejected the scrolls, returned them. That's when the real legend begins. According to folklore, this insult broke something in Sutoku. He stopped writing. He stopped seeking forgiveness. Instead, he turned inward, muttering mantras not for enlightenment but for wrath. By the time he died in 1164, he was no longer viewed as a deposed emperor, but as something worse, a ghost waiting to happen. Japan has a word for that, Onryo, a spirit not simply lingering but actively vengeful, capable of inflicting disasters on the living, especially those who wronged them. Onryo, don't wonder, they haunt. And in the years following Sutoku's death, the capital began to suffer. Unseasonal droughts, fires, plagues, rebellions. Court politics devolved into chaos, and families who had once schemed to depose him now found themselves afflicted by sudden death and ruin. Whether coincidental or not, the sheer number of calamities made one explanation particularly tempting. Sutoku's spirit was angry, and it was winning. The court took notice. Over time, the memory of Sutoku morphed from tragic prince to supernatural menace. In 1221, nearly 60 years after his death, the Jokyu War erupted, a failed attempt by another emperor to reclaim power from the Kamakura shogunate. It ended disastrously. Many believed Sutoku's curse was still rippling through the imperial bloodline, dooming attempts to restore the old order. Eventually, the only way to deal with Sutoku was spiritual diplomacy. Shrines were erected, rites were performed. In a symbolic act of both appeasement and resignation, the court deified him not as a saint, but as a kami, a god spirit, a divine force that could now be worshipped and entreated, rather than feared from a distance. This wasn't forgiveness. It was surrender. The implications are chilling. An emperor, erased from history, returns as a god, not through holiness, but through spite. And the only way to stop his fury is to give him exactly what he was denied in life: recognition, status, voice. You can't undo the injustice. You can only hope the ghost will accept an apology made centuries too late. Today, you can visit the Shiramin Shrine in Kyoto, dedicated to Sutoku and other imperial spirits. Tour guides don't always mention the word curse. They talk about restless energy or historical misfortune. But the story's bones remain unchanged. A man robbed of his birthright, cast out, and then canonized not for his virtue, but for his vengeance. What makes Sutoku's tale especially unsettling is that it isn't even rare in Japanese history. He's not the only imperial ghost to require a posthumous title, a shrine, or an elaborate apology. There are several. Whole cemeteries of compromise. But Sutoku's case stands out because it feels less like a haunting and more like a system correction, the empire acknowledging its own guilt through ritualized fear. And if a ghost can reshape an entire political system, what happens when that ghost isn't tied to a person, but to a place? A head, separated from its body, buried in a quiet corner of Tokyo, and said to bring misfortune to all who dare disturb it. Taira no Masakado's head mound. In the heart of modern Tokyo, surrounded by polished glass towers and the quiet humming of copy machines, there is a small, unassuming patch of land that has stopped bulldozers in their tracks. It's not especially large. No grand signage, just a tidy stone monument, a modest shrine, and the feeling one that gets stronger the longer you stand there that you probably shouldn't be there at all. Locals call it Masakado's Kubizuka, the head mound. It is said to contain the severed head of Taira no Masakado, a 10th century samurai who rebelled against the central government, declared himself the new emperor of the East, and paid for that title with his life. But what makes this shrine remarkable is not the rebellion, or even the decapitation, it's what happened after Masakado died. Or rather, what refused to stay dead. Let's start at the beginning. Masakado was born into the elite Taira clan, a family of military aristocrats that held considerable sway during Japan's Heian period. Ambitious, bold, and deeply territorial, he clashed repeatedly with his cousins over land rights, eventually escalating the feud into a full-scale rebellion. By the 932nd, he was no longer just a local warlord. He had declared himself an independent ruler, separate from the Kyoto court. For a brief, astonishing moment, he styled himself as the ruler of Eastern Japan. It was political heresy, unthinkable, and extremely short-lived. In 940, imperial forces caught up with him. He was killed in battle, beheaded, in fact, and his head was sent to Kyoto as a warning to others. There it was, put on public display, an age-old political message. This is what happens when you challenge the throne. But Masakado's head didn't behave the way a head was supposed to. According to legend, the severed head remained intact for months, its eyes open, its expression furious. Some claimed it refused to decay. Others said it screamed through the night. Eventually, either out of pity or fear, someone buried it. Not in Kyoto, but back in the region Masakado had once ruled, what is now Tokyo. And that's when the curse began to grow. Over the next 1,000 years, every attempt to disturb or move the head mound met with complications. In 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake leveled much of Tokyo. In the rush to rebuild, government officials decided to relocate the Kubizuka to make room for modern development. Workers who participated in the project reportedly died or fell ill under mysterious circumstances. Some were injured in bizarre accidents. One government minister who oversaw the move died shortly afterward. Eventually, construction halted, and the shrine was rebuilt on the original site. Then came World War II. After Japan's surrender in 1945, occupying American forces stationed in Tokyo eyed the Kubizuka with their usual architectural pragmatism. It was, after all, just a plot of land, prime real estate, in a dense city. Plans were drawn to level it, perhaps convert it into a parking lot or office space. But those plans didn't get very far. Before work could begin, a bulldozer flipped inexplicably on flat ground, injuring the operator. Other soldiers involved in the project reported strange mechanical failures. One officer reportedly fell ill and had to be reassigned. Whether coincidence or curse, the Americans quickly reversed course. The land was left untouched. Locals say even the foreign military could sense it. Masakado was not to be provoked. To this day, major construction firms in Tokyo avoid building on or around the site. Some executives leave offerings. Others insist their employees pray at the shrine before beginning any nearby development. It's not required by law, it's just what you do. And while no official policy mentions the curse, everyone seems to understand it. What makes Masakado's legend uniquely unnerving is its civic reach. This isn't a haunted forest or a cursed jewel. This is a square of earth in one of the most technologically advanced cities in the world. A city built on science, innovation, and relentless efficiency. Yet here, in the middle of all that progress, is a patch of land that time refuses to erase. A place where ancient power is still respected not out of faith, but out of fear. Masakado isn't even reviled. In fact, over time, he's become a kind of protective spirit for Tokyo. Locals make offerings, office workers bow in passing. During crises, earthquakes, pandemics, people return to the Kubizuka to pray for safety. As if the man who once defied the throne now stands watch over the very city that grew from his rebellion. Which raises the question, was the curse really a curse, or was it a warning that slowly morphed into guardianship? Either way, the pattern is clear. Every time someone tries to remove, disturb, or forget Masakado, something cracks, and every time he is honored, the city seems to breathe easier. But Japan is not alone in binding tragedy to objects. Centuries before Masakado's fury halted bulldozers in Tokyo, a sapphire-hued diamond was plucked from a crown, scattered across continents, and followed by a suspiciously long trail of beheadings and betrayals. The Hope Diamond's royal curse. Gleaming with an icy sapphire fire, the Hope Diamond is one of those objects that makes you pause not just because it's beautiful, but because it feels aware. It's only 45.52 carats now, but it once weighed over 112, carved from the legendary Tavernier blue, plucked, most likely, from the Kolar mine in 17th century India. Back then, it shimmered with an uncanny depth. A violet blue light that made observers describe it in the language of divinity or doom. Depending on the story you prefer, the diamond was either sacred or stolen from the forehead of a temple idol, which is, of course, the fastest way to give a gem a curse that lasts centuries. Let's get this out of the way. There's no hard evidence that the Hope Diamond was ever pried from a statue. That version of the story is probably European exoticism at work, spicing up colonial treasure theft with a dose of divine retribution. But the curse? The curse does not seem to care about origin stories. It simply followed the stone wherever it went, from kings to thieves to heresies to museum glass, and left a strangely symmetrical trail of destruction in its wake. The diamond first emerged into European records through Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, the French gem merchant who allegedly brought it from India in the 1662. Tavernier sold it to King Louis XIV, who had it recut into the French blue and set into the crown jewels. So far, so glorious. Then things got messy. Louis XIV died of gangrene. His heir, Louis XV, lived long enough to see France's international prestige decay. But it was Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, wearing the diamond in all its pre-revolutionary glory, who would bear the brunt of its reputation. Both were executed during the French Revolution, their reign cut short by guillotines, insurrection, and the fury of a starving populace. And though the diamond wasn't the cause of the revolution, no gemstone can incite class war. It became a symbol of doomed royalty, something beautiful, heavy, and cursed by extravagance. After the royal executions, the French blue vanished during a looting of the crown jewels. For decades, it was lost to history, until it resurfaced in 1812, suspiciously recut, conveniently just small enough to avoid being legally identified as the stolen royal gem. It passed through the hands of bankers, smugglers, and unlucky collectors until it reached the Hope family, who gave the diamond its modern name, and in return, received financial ruin, early deaths, and a family legacy forever shadowed by tragedy. From there, the diamond made its rounds. It was sold to a Turkish sultan. His concubine allegedly drowned. His court collapsed. Another owner, a Russian princess, was murdered. An American heiress, Evelyn Walsh McLean, bought the stone in the early 20th century and wore it like a badge of defiance. She lost her son, her daughter, her husband, and eventually her sanity. Again, some of this is tabloid myth-making, but some of it isn't. The curious thing about the Hope Diamond isn't just the number of misfortunes connected to it, it's the pattern. The diamond always seems to attract attention at precisely the wrong moment, when a regime is nearing collapse, when a fortune is about to run dry, when an empire is about to crack. The gem arrives, gleams, and witnesses the unraveling. That's not causation, but it's a hard coincidence to ignore. Eventually, the Hope Diamond landed in the hands of jeweler Harry Winston, who donated it to the Smithsonian Institution in 1958. In a moment of uncanny symbolism, he literally mailed it in a brown paper package via US Postal Service, insured for a fraction of its actual worth. It now rests in a bulletproof glass case in Washington, D.C., rotating slowly in its display, forever wreathed in artificial light. There have been no public tragedies since it was institutionalized, no plagues or beheadings or theatrical bankruptcies tied to its presence at the museum. Which raises an interesting question. Was the curse neutralized by science? Or is it simply dormant content to sit behind glass, untouched, admired, but no longer possessed? Because that seems to be the through line. The diamond's misfortunes follow the people who try to own it, to wear it, to turn it into a symbol of something bigger than it is. But under glass, divorced from power or ego, it becomes almost docile. Beautiful, yes. Dangerous? Only if you try to take it home. Today, school children peer at it on field trips. Tourists take blurry photos. Security guards blink through 12-hour shifts, while the Hope turns slowly in its display, like the world's most elegant doomsday clock. But history doesn't forget. The diamond still holds the stories of kingdoms fallen, fortunes evaporated, heads quite literally lost. And while its supernatural reputation may have dulled with time, one truth remains. Some objects don't forgive their owners. And if a cursed diamond can tear through dynasties and empires, what of a dying king whose final words condemned an entire nation, ensuring that for nearly 1,000 years, no one from his own people would ever rule them again? King Zvonimir's dying curse. Some curses are poetic, some are tragic, some are embroidered into legend like gold thread on a shroud meant to impress more than they explain. But then there are curses like the one attributed to King Dimitar Zvonimir of Croatia, whose final words were said to be neither eloquent nor metaphorical, but coldly specific. May you never again be ruled by a king of your own blood. If that quote feels a little too on the nose, that's because it is. Zvonimir's curse, if it happened at all, reads less like folklore and more like an historical spreadsheet, checkmarked, updated, and followed by 900 years of grim compliance. The Croatian crown would never again sit permanently on the head of a native-born monarch. Not really, not in the way it had during his time. And it all allegedly began with a murder, or at the very least, a betrayal. King Zvonimir ruled Croatia in the late 11th century, a time when the kingdom sat uneasily between the Byzantine Empire to the east, the Holy Roman Empire to the north, and the ever-looming Catholic Church to the west. Diplomacy was a blood sport, and Zvonimir, by most accounts, was a moderate player. He worked to strengthen ties with the Vatican, introduced reforms, supported religious orders, and tried to balance Croatian sovereignty with papal loyalty, a strategy that, historically, rarely ends with peaceful retirement. The trouble began when Pope Urban II, yes, the same pope who would later launch the First Crusade, allegedly requested Zvonimir send Croatian troops to support Christian campaigns in the Holy Land. This, depending on the version of the story you read, sparked outrage among the Croatian nobility. They had no interest in bleeding for Rome's ambitions. Some even feared the move would make Croatia a puppet state. And so, according to legend, they turned on him. One version claims he was stabbed to death at a church altar during an assembly at 9. Another says he died of heartbreak after being cursed by his own people. A third insists he was simply overthrown and vanished, leaving the tale to be filled in later by scandal-hungry historians and monks with a flair for drama. Whichever version you pick, the result was the same. Zvonimir died angrily, abruptly, and without a successor. But before his death again, according to local lore, he issued his fateful curse. The exact words are lost to time, but the gist has been boiled down and passed from generation to generation with eerie consistency. Let no Croat ever again sit the throne as king, whether spoken in rage, grief, or defiance. The curse echoed and stuck. After Zvonimir's death, Croatia entered one of its most turbulent political chapters. In 1102, just a few decades later, the Pacta Conventa bound Croatia to Hungary in a personal union. The crown passed to King Koloman of Hungary, and from that point forward, Croatia's sovereignty became a political balancing act, oscillating between semi-autonomy and full absorption, depending on the era and the ambitions of whichever foreign crown was in charge. But what remained curiously consistent was the absence of native kings. For centuries, Croats were ruled by outsiders, Hungarians, Austrians, Habsburgs. Even after revolts, reforms, and occasional flirtations with independence, the monarchy never returned to Croatian blood, not even briefly. In the 20th century, the monarchy was replaced altogether. After World War I, Croatia was absorbed into the kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, later Yugoslavia, under the Serbian House of Karađorđević. Then came war, communism, collapse, and finally independence in the 1992nd. Yet to this day, the nation has never re-established a monarchy of its own. Was that Zvonimir's doing? Probably not. History is rarely so obedient. There are geopolitical reasons for every twist in the Croatian crown's trajectory: wars, treaties, papal meddling, and dynastic marriages. But that's the point. The curse doesn't need to be supernatural to feel real. It just needs to line up with reality enough to make the skin prickle. And it does. In modern Croatia, Zvonimir is remembered with complicated reverence. Streets and schools bear his name. Statues mark his former capital. Yet beneath the national pride is a faint, persistent unease. The sense that something was broken in that moment, whether by murder or malediction, and it's never fully healed. Some say the curse is lifted now, after all. Croatia is a republic. It rules itself. It elects its leaders. The age of kings is long gone. But the symbolism remains. For nearly a millennium, no native king has risen. Zvonimir was the last, the final monarch of Croatian blood to rule Croatia outright. And if his final words were, in fact, a curse, then he didn't just predict the future, he commanded it. Which brings us to a different kind of royal vengeance, not from a king or a battlefield, but from a queen cast aside. A woman demonized, betrayed, and according to ancient Sri Lankan chronicles, cursed the bloodline of her unfaithful lover so thoroughly that none of his children would ever rule again. Kuveni's curse on King Vijaya's line. In the mythic dawn of Sri Lanka's recorded history, where stories merge freely with legend and kings walk beside gods, there was a queen named Kuveni, a figure so central to the island's origin story, and so thoroughly betrayed, that her final curse is still remembered like a bruise on the soul of a nation. To understand the weight of her words, you have to go back to the first chapters of the Mahavamsa, Sri Lanka's 5th century chronicle of kingship. There, the arrival of Prince Vijaya, the man who would be credited as the first Sinhalese king, is treated not as coincidence, but as cosmic choreography. Vijaya, an exiled Indian prince from the ancient kingdom of Sinhapura, landed on the shores of Sri Lanka with 700 followers. It was an island of forests and fog, ruled at the time by yakshas, spirits or demons, depending on your interpretive mood, and it was here that he encountered Kuveni. Kuveni wasn't just a local. She was the reigning queen of the yakshas. In some versions, she's portrayed as a sorceress, in others, a demoness. But all versions agree. She was powerful, cunning, and utterly enchanted by the foreign prince who had just landed on her shores. And Vijaya? He saw a useful ally. In exchange for her loyalty, and possibly her love, Kuveni helped Vijaya defeat the yakshas, securing him the throne of the island. She bore him 2 children and, according to some legends, dreamed of a kingdom shared. But when Vijaya solidified his rule, he decided he needed something else. Legitimacy in the eyes of the Indian kings and a queen of pure lineage. So he sent for a princess from the mainland. And Kuveni? He cast her out. Abandoned and heartbroken, she wandered the forests with her children. Depending on which retelling you hear, she was either killed by her own people for her betrayal, or she vanished into the wilds, vowing vengeance. But what echoes through the centuries is this. She cursed him, and his line, that none of Vijaya's children, hers or otherwise, would ever inherit the throne. It wasn't a vague prophecy. It was as specific as a bloodline. And perhaps inconveniently for historians, it turned out to be true. Vijaya died without an heir. Though he had children with Kuveni, they were considered illegitimate. His royal marriage to the Indian princess produced no offspring. In the end, Vijaya's throne was passed not to a son, but to a nephew, who arrived from India after Vijaya's death. From the very beginning, the royal line of Sri Lanka was adopted borrowed from another land. Kuveni's children were erased, and the kingdom's mythology quietly complied. The Mahavamsa, while comprehensive, treats Kuveni with dismissive contempt. She is a footnote, a temptress, an obstacle to be discarded. But her absence only amplifies her legend. Among the island's indigenous people, the Vedas, believed by many to be Kuveni's descendants, her story survives not as a cautionary tale, but as an ancestral wound. A reminder that the first woman of the island was also its first ghost. Over the centuries, Sri Lanka's royal lineage shifted, fractured, and reconstituted many times through conquest, colonization, rebellion. But through all that, something curious remains. The original king's bloodline never reigned. Kuveni's children never ruled. Vijaya's own descendants, by both love and law, never ascended. It's as though the foundation of the monarchy itself was built on an erasure, and that erasure echoed. Scholars will tell you it was about legitimacy, politics, the need to establish Indo-Aryan roots for the Sinhalese dynasty, and distance the new kingdom from its more mystical, native past. But the curse doesn't care about politics. It just plays out, century after century, like an unpaid debt. What makes Kuveni's curse so uniquely tragic is that it's rooted in personal betrayal. This wasn't a foreign queen waging war. This wasn't an ancient god smiting the arrogant. This was a woman who gave everything, her power, her people, her body, to a man who promised a shared future and delivered abandonment. It's a heartbreak so intimate, it became national. Even today, Kuveni occupies a strange space in the Sri Lankan imagination. She is feared, pitied, misunderstood, neither fully demon nor fully human, neither entirely villain nor clearly victim. Her image appears in local folklore, dramatized rituals, and the quiet acknowledgements of those who trace their lineage to a forgotten queen who was never crowned. And her curse, still intact. Even though Sri Lanka no longer has a monarchy, and hasn't for decades, the symbolic weight of that broken promise of a lineage denied its legacy still lingers. It lives in historical gaps, in archaeological silences, in stories whispered by the Vedas that rarely make it into textbooks. Because if history is written by the victors, then curses are preserved by the forgotten. And Kuveni, once written out of the royal script, made sure her curse would outlive the throne itself. But curses don't always come from queens. Sometimes they come from saints, especially the ones who smile politely while quietly undoing entire cities and kings with nothing more than a well-timed phrase. Nizamuddin Auliya versus Sultan Ghiyath al-Din Tughlaq. In the grand theatre of Delhi's history, a city built and rebuilt across dynasties, empires, and illusions of permanence, there are two names that never seem to fade. One belonged to a Sufi saint, the other to a sultan. And their collision in the 14th century remains one of India's most enigmatic examples of spiritual authority quietly undoing imperial ambition, one sardonic phrase at a time. The saint was Hazrat Nizamuddin Auliya, a revered mystic of the Chishti order, known not for miracles or firebrand preaching, but for something more dangerous: influence. He was beloved by the people, feared by the powerful, and deeply embedded in Delhi's spiritual and political consciousness. Kings visited him, poets flocked to him. The common man found comfort in his simplicity. And in a society defined by hierarchies, he refused to bow to any. The Sultan was Ghiyath al-Din Tughlaq, founder of the Tughlaq dynasty, a ruler obsessed with order, structure, and very specific architectural plans. He had returned to Delhi after a military campaign in Bengal and ordered the construction of a brand new fort and city, Tughlaqabad, on the southern edge of Delhi. A city of stone, strategy, and sharp edges. A monument to his legacy. But there was a problem. Nizamuddin Auliya was also building something. A bauli, or stepwell, near his Khanqa, Sufi lodge, meant to serve the thirsty poor. The Sultan, ever possessive of labour and loyalty, decreed that all workers should be diverted to his project. The saint, in response, refused to halt his stepwell and quietly continued the work, often at night. And then came the line, short, unassuming, whispered more than proclaimed. Hunuz dili dorast. Delhi is still far. The phrase was not a prophecy. It was, by all appearances, an observation. But like all good curses, it slipped past the mind and went straight for the spine. It was said, in response to the Sultan's plan, to return to Delhi after his victory in Bengal. His court, his city, his throne, all waited. But Nizamuddin, when asked about the Sultan's impending arrival, offered only those 4 words. Delhi is still far. Within days of setting off toward his capital, Ghiyath al-Din died. Accounts vary. Some say a pavilion built to welcome him collapsed during a celebration. Others suggest sabotage, possibly orchestrated by his own son, Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Whatever the truth, the Sultan never made it home. He was buried in the very fortress he had built. Tughlaqabad, the city he had demanded, rose like a stone skeleton from the scrublands and promptly began to crumble. Deserted by his heirs, plagued by structural problems, and eventually swallowed by the encroaching earth, it became a ruin in record time. Today, it remains largely untouched. A hulking relic of forgotten ambition. Visitors report a strange stillness there, monuments of stone echoing with the memory of a man who tried to outbuild a saint and lost. As for Nizamuddin, he endured. His dargah, shrine, in Delhi, is still visited by thousands every week. It has survived dynasties, plagues, invasions, colonialism, and modern real estate. Poets like Amir Khusro, his beloved disciple, are buried nearby. The air smells of rosewater and sandalwood, and somewhere under the scent of incense is the faint trace of quiet triumph. Of course, it's tempting to view this as a simple moral tale. Power versus piety. King versus saint. Ego versus humility. But that would flatten the irony too much. Because Nizamuddin didn't curse the Sultan. He didn't demand vengeance or claim divine wrath. He merely stated what was in that moment true. Delhi was still far, and the truth, in the right hands, can be a curse all its own. Later legends would add another line to Nizamuddin's low-profile arsenal. When told about the construction of Tughlaqabad, he supposedly said, "May it remain inhabited only by shepherds and owls," which it did, eventually. The juxtaposition is striking. One man builds monuments of stone, the other of spirit. One demands obedience, the other inspires it. One dies mid-triumph, the other lives forever in prayer. The irony isn't that Nizamuddin won, it's that he didn't try to. He just outlasted. And maybe that's why his words still echo more than 700 years later. Not because they called down wrath, but because they reflected something the Sultan couldn't control: time, impermanence, and the futility of trying to force yourself into history with bricks and mortar alone. But in Japan, they understood that lesson early, that the dead could linger, that wronged men could become gods. And when the court exiled a brilliant scholar to a stormy province and then watched the capital burst into fire and chaos, they did what any empire does when it realizes it's made a mistake. They built him a shrine and begged for mercy. Sugawara no Michizane, Tenyin, as vengeful kami. In the refined, rule-bound halls of the Heian court, where every word was calculated, every robe precisely folded, and every poem an act of politics, Sugawara no Michizane was not supposed to matter. He wasn't born into the Fujiwara clan, the aristocratic hydra that dominated the imperial court of 9th century Japan like ivy wrapped around a dying tree. He was a scholar, a civil servant, a man of letters in a world run by bloodlines. And yet, for a moment, he rose. Michizane was brilliant. His poetry dazzled, his grasp of Chinese classics earned him high office, and even the emperor began to notice him not merely as an administrator, but as a confidant. For a few fleeting years, he was elevated beyond his station, promoted to high court rank, and set on a trajectory that, if uninterrupted, might have made him the most powerful non-Fujiwara figure of his time. And that, of course, was the problem. Power is rarely taken kindly when it arrives without pedigree. The Fujiwaras, feeling threatened, launched a quiet campaign of bureaucratic assassination. They accused Michizane of plotting treason, specifically, of trying to replace the current emperor with a rival heir. There was no proof. That was irrelevant. The machinery of accusation was more than enough. In 901 CE, Michizane was stripped of his titles, exiled to the storm-racked province of Dazaifu in Kyushu, and left to wither in the margins of the country he once helped govern. He died 2 years later, broken, forgotten, his children disgraced, his name scrubbed. And then the disasters began. The capital Heian-kyo, modern-day Kyoto, was gripped by misfortune. A plague spread through the court. Famine gripped the countryside. Lightning struck the imperial palace, igniting a fire that destroyed major buildings. High-ranking officials, including those involved in Michizane's exile, began dying unexpectedly. Some were struck by illness, others by what could only be described as freak accidents. One Fujiwara statesman fell dead during an imperial meeting. No war, no revolution. Just a slow, terrifying unraveling. The court began to whisper. Perhaps it was just bad luck. Perhaps Japan was experiencing the volatile swings of nature and politics that marked much of its early history. But as the misfortunes grew increasingly symbolic lightning from the heavens, fires in the halls of power, the question sharpened into a fearful certainty. Was Michizane angry? In traditional Japanese belief, Honroi vengeful spirits could wreak havoc from beyond the grave, especially those who died unjustly, especially those whose rage could not be buried. And so, quietly, and then not so quietly, the court began to make amends. They restored Michizane's titles. They declared him innocent. They promoted him posthumously, elevating him to high office in the spiritual bureaucracy of the dead. And then, as the disasters continued, they did something radical. They deified him. Sugawara no Michizane became Tenjin, a Shinto kami, or god, of scholarship, learning, and writing. The very qualities that had once made him suspect now became sacred. Shrines were built, offerings were made, rituals were performed not just to honor him, but to appease him, to turn a furious spirit into a protective deity. It worked. Or, at the very least, the disasters began to ease, and over time, the image of Michizane shifted in the national consciousness. No longer a bureaucratic casualty or a haunted threat, he became a kind of spiritual patron saint of students. Today, there are over 10,000 Tenjin shrines across Japan. During exam season, students line up to pray to him for wisdom, for clarity, for mercy. But underneath the polite rituals and scholarly prayers, the core of his story remains deeply unsettling, because it was never about divinity. It was about damage control. The court didn't worship Michizane because he was holy. They worshipped him because they feared what he might still do. His shrine in Dazaifu, the place of his exile, is one of the most visited in the country. People go there for luck, for grades, for peace. But the air around it is heavy with irony. A man cast out for learning, now immortalized for it. A man erased from history, now one of its gods. There's something profoundly modern about this ancient story, a bureaucracy that punished brilliance, a smear campaign that worked too well. A public figure destroyed by whispers and then deified when it was politically convenient. It's not just a ghost story, it's a case study. And perhaps that's what makes Michizane's curse so enduring. It didn't unleash monsters or plagues alone, it forced an empire to reckon with its own moral rot. It made the most powerful men in Japan confess, in silence, that they had built their palace on betrayal. And then they named the ghost a god and asked him to forgive them. But not all spirits can be bribed, and not all wronged royals stop with deification. Because just a century later, another imperial exile would die with injustice burning in his veins, and the only way to stop his wrath was to give him a throne he never sat on in life: Prince Sawara's posthumous emperorship. In the delicate machinery of ancient Japan's imperial court, silence could kill as efficiently as swords. Status was everything more than truth, more than blood, more than justice. And in the year 785 CE, that machinery chewed up and discarded a prince named Sawara, who, despite royal birth and close proximity to power, became a ghost so dangerous, the government had no choice but to name him emperor after he was already dead. Let's start with the politics. Prince Sawara was the younger brother of Emperor Kanmu, one of the most significant rulers in Japanese history, who would eventually relocate the capital to Heian-kyo, what we now call Kyoto. But before that capital ever existed, the imperial court sat in Nagaoka, a newer, shinier replacement for the previous capital at Heijoka. Kanmu had made the move for strategic reasons, some military, some astrological, and plenty political. But new capitals bring new enemies. And in this particular chapter, the name on everyone's tongue was Fujiwara no Tanetsugu. Tanetsugu, a high-ranking courtier and close confidant of Emperor Kanmu, was tasked with overseeing the construction of Nagaoka-kyo. He was efficient, favored, and powerful, a dangerous combination in a court that ran on gossip and quiet resentment. Then, in 785, Tanetsugu was assassinated. The murder shook the court, not just because it was bold executions were one thing, but high-ranking assassination was another, but because it threatened to crack the already fragile legitimacy of the new capital. The officials needed someone to blame. They needed a scapegoat fast. And Prince Sawara was standing too close. At the time, Sawara had been vocal in his opposition to Tanetsugu and the entire Nagaoka project. He believed the move was reckless, politically risky, maybe even cosmically ill-fated. So when the knives came out and Tanetsugu fell, Sawara became the natural suspect, despite no hard evidence tying him to the plot. Kanmu, torn between royal blood and imperial image, exiled his own brother. Sawara was stripped of rank and ordered to be taken to Awaji Island, a remote, sea-ringed exile site historically used to make inconvenient nobles disappear. But before Sawara even arrived, he died. Whether from illness, despair, or hunger is unclear. What matters is that he never returned. And then the disasters began. Not long after Sawara's death, strange and deadly misfortunes swept through the imperial court. The emperor's wife died. His favorite son fell ill. The construction of Nagaoka-kyo was plagued by accidents, deaths, and inexplicable delays. Floods destroyed critical infrastructure. Workers refused to return. Earthquakes. Fires. Panic. The capital that was supposed to symbolize rebirth began to feel cursed. And in a quiet whisper that grew louder with each catastrophe, the court began to murmur the unthinkable. Prince Sawara was angry. In Japanese belief, particularly during the Heian period, the concept of Onryo, a wrathful spirit of the unjustly wronged, was not poetic metaphor. It was policy relevant. Ghosts could harm emperors, topple dynasties, and sink cities. And Sawara, wronged by his own blood, denied a fair trial, and buried in disgrace was the perfect candidate for spiritual vengeance. So, the court did what only an empire terrified of its own reflection would do. They made him emperor. In 800 CE, 15 years after his death, Sawara was posthumously named Emperor Sudo. It was a stunning gesture, less an honor and more a spiritual negotiation. He had never ruled. He had never sat on the throne. But now, by imperial decree, he was to be treated as if he had. His grave was upgraded, rituals were performed, offerings made. The state, in effect, tried to rewrite reality just enough to calm the dead. And slowly, the disasters stopped. Not immediately, not all at once, but the flood of misfortunes began to ease. The capital was moved again, this time to Heian-kyo, which would become one of Japan's most iconic cities. The court, newly sensitive to the wrath of neglected spirits, started a pattern of elevating and appeasing the dead whenever things got too unlucky. Prince Sawara became a cautionary legend, a reminder that exile and disgrace could echo louder after death than in life. A case study in what happens when the machinery of power moves too quickly, too carelessly, and leaves someone crushed beneath its wheels. His story remains relatively obscure in the West, but in Japan, his name still conjures that uneasy feeling that injustice doesn't dissolve, it compounds. Even the imperial titles given to him were phrased delicately, almost apologetically, as if saying, "We're not sorry for what happened, we're just sorry you noticed." And perhaps that's the most haunting part. The court didn't reverse its decision out of ethics. They reversed it out of fear. The same system that exiled him now needed his forgiveness. Not to correct the past, but to secure the future. Because when the dead are wronged in Japan, you don't just pray for them, you promote them. You give them titles. You build them shrines. You acknowledge that their grievances matter more after death than they ever did in life. And if one prince's angry ghost could derail an entire capital city, what happens when the spirits of an entire clan, including a drowned child emperor, are believed to curse the sea itself, dragging ships to the bottom out of grief, revenge, and memory that refuses to fade? The curse of the Heike. Some tragedies make history, others haunt it. The fall of the Taira clan, better known by their poetic name, the Heike, did both. Their story is written into the bones of Japan's cultural memory like a funeral chant with no end. But this isn't just a tale of military defeat. It's a curse, one soaked in salt water, wrapped in Buddhist impermanence, and whispered through every lost ship and storm-darkened wave that followed. The Taira clan rose fast, too fast. In the late 12th century, they were one of the most powerful families in Japan, holding key court positions, controlling trade, marrying into the imperial line. Their leader, Taira no Kiyomori, climbed from general to de facto ruler of the empire. He placed his grandson, Emperor Antoku, a child, on the throne, making the Heike both political masters and imperial stewards. But such heights attract rivals. Enter the Minamoto clan, the Heike's old blood enemies, driven by vendetta and ideology, itching to restore balance. What followed was the Genpei War, a 5-year civil war of shifting alliances, castle sieges, and escalating violence, culminating in one of the most devastating battles in Japanese history, the Battle of Dan no Yura in 1185. Dan no Yura was a naval engagement fought in the swirling currents of the Shimonoseki Strait. The Taira fleet was strong, but so was the Minamoto's, and betrayal soon turned the tide. A key Taira general defected mid-battle, revealing their formations. The Heike forces were surrounded, their options ran out, and then came the moment that would give birth to a legend. Realizing the war was lost, the Heike commanders chose death over capture. They began leaping into the sea. But this wasn't merely ritual suicide, it was a mass erasure. The Empress Dowager leapt into the waves, carrying the 8-year-old Emperor Antoku in her arms. She is said to have whispered Buddhist prayers to the child before vanishing into the water with him, dragging the imperial regalia, the sacred sword, mirror, and jewel with her. Only 2 of the 3 treasures were ever recovered. The sword was lost. Some say it still lies at the bottom of the sea. Others believe it was retrieved but never spoken of again. The child emperor was never seen again. No grave, no farewell. And the sea, from that day on, was cursed. Fishermen along the coast began reporting strange lights beneath the waves, ghostly figures drifting in the shallows, unlucky catches, dead fish, voices in the mist. The dead, it seemed, had not left. They were still there, angry, grieving, trapped in a tide that never stopped pulling. These weren't just spooky stories told to children. The belief in the Heike spirits, or Heike-gani, Heike, crabs, became part of the local folklore. The crabs in the region developed unusual patterns on their shells, markings that resemble angry, frowning faces. Fishermen refused to eat them, believing they bore the souls of the drowned Taira warriors. Even scientists took note. In the 20th century, biologist Julian Huxley famously theorized that human selection throwing back crabs with faces may have unintentionally helped evolve the pattern through natural selection. But science didn't quiet the stories, because the curse wasn't about biology, it was about memory. The Heike were mourned in oral epics passed down by blind monks called Biwa Hoshi, who wandered Japan reciting the Heike Monogatari, the tale of the Heike. Their music told of ambition, glory, arrogance, and downfall, of a child emperor swallowed by the sea, of a sword that never came back, of a family that flew too close to power and burned not in fire but in water. And then came the shipwrecks. For centuries, the Shimonoseki Strait remained one of the most perilous passages in Japanese waters. Unpredictable currents, sudden squalls, disappearances. Sailors believed the Heike were pulling ships under not out of malice, but because they didn't want to be forgotten. Every sunken vessel was a gravestone, every drowned sailor a witness. Even in modern Japan, the memory lingers. Memorials to the Heike dot the coastline. At the Akama Shrine, Emperor Antoku is enshrined not as a victim, but as a deity. His spirit finally offered peace, though never fully silenced. Each year, the Shunki Raitazai Festival reenacts the epic, drawing mourners, tourists, and believers alike. Boats are sent out, prayers are read. The sea is asked, once again, to be merciful. But the unease remains, not because the curse is still active in some literal way, but because the story is too perfect. A dynasty collapses into the sea. A child dies with the weight of an empire around his neck, and the ocean refuses to let the story end. And maybe that's the lesson the Heike left behind, that power gained without wisdom is fleeting, and the sea remembers what history tries to wash away. But while the Heike's vengeance was mythologized in waves and shell-carved faces, another royal curse took a quieter form, a pale woman in white drifting through the corridors of palaces in Germany, foretelling death not with thunder, but with presence, the White Lady of the Hohenzollerns. In the shadowed corners of Central Europe's great castles, where the flags of empires once fluttered and every footstep echoes off centuries of conquest, there is a figure who does not belong to any single moment in history. She wears white, she walks without sound, and wherever she appears, a royal death soon follows. They call her Die Weissfrau, the White Lady, and for over 500 years she has haunted the royal houses of Germany, Prussia, and Austria, leaving behind no blood, no scars, no howls in the night. Just witnesses and a legacy of dread so consistent that monarchs recorded her sightings like political intelligence. If a Hohenzollern prince said he saw her, you prepared a coffin. The curse, if that's what it is, begins with a woman named Kunigunde von Orlamünde. And like many good ghost stories, hers starts with a heartbreak and ends with a legend that outlived the empire she supposedly cursed. Kunigunde was a noblewoman of the early 14th century. After her husband died, she fell in love with Albert of Nuremberg, a member of the rising Hohenzollern dynasty. But according to the most chilling version of the tale, when she asked him to marry her, he replied perhaps evasively that he could not unless 4 eyes were removed. Whether he meant metaphorical obstacles or meddlesome relatives is unclear. But Kunigunde, desperate and tragically literal, interpreted it to mean her 2 children, and so, the story claims, she killed them, believing this sacrifice would win her place beside her lover. She was wrong. When Albert discovered what she had done, he rejected her in horror. Shunned and broken, Kunigunde retreated to a convent, where she died in obscurity, but not before, according to legend, swearing vengeance on the family that had scorned her. And not just vengeance in life, vengeance forever. She began appearing soon after, first in Plassenburg Castle, then at Berlin, Potsdam, Vienna, and every other Hohenzollern seat of power. Her figure was unmistakable, a woman in a long white gown, pale-faced, veiled or unveiled depending on the version, gliding silently through hallways and staircases, vanishing just as quickly as she came. The timing was always consistent. A royal would die within days. Historical records, yes. Actual official records note sightings in astonishing detail. In 1619, she was seen at the court of Emperor Matthias of Habsburg, who died shortly after. In 1785, King Frederick William II of Prussia reported a ghostly figure, and within the year, he was dead. In 1840, when King Frederick William III passed away, attendants swore they'd seen a woman in white standing by his bed. Even the famously pragmatic Frederick the Great, a king more inclined toward Voltaire than visions, allegedly saw the White Lady shortly before the death of his father and recorded the event not as hysteria, but as fact. She wasn't vengeful in the traditional sense. She didn't scream. She didn't chase. She didn't bring storms or earthquakes. She simply showed up, and then, inevitably, someone didn't wake up. Over time, the Hohenzollerns treated her less like a ghost and more like a grim emissary. Her appearances were logged, her presence accepted. Palaces kept quiet when she was seen. There was no sense in panicking, only preparing. And because the Hohenzollerns didn't fall all at once, but gradually over centuries she kept working, one family member at a time. Skeptics, of course, point to the power of suggestion. Once you expect a ghost, any shadow becomes a woman in white. Any sleepless night in a drafty palace becomes a haunting. The White Lady was a self-fulfilling myth. They argue a generational hallucination bolstered by stress, candlelight, and too much inherited guilt. But that doesn't explain the frequency, the consistency. The fact that from the 1502nd through the 20th century, she kept showing up like a cursed bureaucrat with an appointment list. What's particularly unnerving is how non-violent the curse seems. No accidents, no plagues, no mass executions, just presence. As if her very existence was the message, remember what was done. And what was done. Whether or not Kunigunde actually murdered her children, or whether the Hohenzollerns wronged her at all, the story persisted. For centuries. It passed through the Reformation, the Enlightenment, Napoleon, World War I, and through it all, the White Lady of the Hohenzollerns kept showing up. She was last reportedly seen in the early 20th century, shortly before the death of Wilhelm II, the last German emperor, who abdicated in 1918 after the defeat in World War I. Some say she visited one final time, walking the halls of a broken empire, not as a warning but as an endnote. Today, the Hohenzollern dynasty survives only symbolically. Their castles are now museums. Their family disputes play out in courtrooms, not coronations. But the White Lady, she remains part of the story. A spectral footnote too persistent to erase. A reminder that sometimes the dead don't rage, they simply observe, quietly, consistently, until they're no longer needed. But not all cursed royals wait patiently. In Spain, there once ruled a king so broken, so eerily dysfunctional, that the entire continent believed he had been bewitched from birth and that the future of Europe had been doomed by a royal curse written into his very blood. El Hechizado, Spain's cursed king, Charles II. When the last Habsburg king of Spain was born in 1661, his arrival was met with fanfare and ominous curiosity. From the outside, it looked like the continuation of a great imperial legacy. From the inside, it looked like something had gone terribly wrong. The boy was named Charles, but history remembers him by a darker title: El Hechizado, the Bewitched. For centuries, Spain had been a superpower flooded with gold from the Americas, dominating oceans, culture, and war alike. But beneath the grandeur, the royal bloodline had begun to twist in on itself. The Spanish Habsburgs, in their obsession with pure blood, had married so often within the family that their family tree looked more like a tightly braided rope. By the time Charles II was born, that rope was fraying at every end. His lineage was so entangled that his father was also his mother's uncle, his grandmother was also his aunt, his great-grandparents were also siblings. The genetic consequences weren't subtle. From childhood, Charles suffered from a raft of debilitating issues: severe physical frailty, developmental delays, difficulty speaking, and an inability to digest properly. His jaw was so pronounced, the famous Habsburg chin, that he could barely chew. He was small, sickly, and prone to seizures. He couldn't walk until he was 4. He didn't speak until he was 8. But this wasn't a child born into obscurity. He was the King of Spain. And when the child king failed to develop properly, the explanations didn't stay medical, they turned supernatural. The Spanish court, deeply religious and marinated in Catholic mysticism, began to suspect that Charles wasn't merely ill, he was cursed, bewitched, hexed by enemies of the state. His condition, they believed, was not the result of incestuous lineage or genetic collapse, but maleficio dark magic. As Charles grew, the whispers hardened into belief. His failures as a ruler, military defeats, economic collapse, civil unrest were attributed to spells, not policy. His body became a national metaphor, decaying, incoherent, cursed from within. And, in response, the court didn't call for reform, they called for exorcists. Yes, actual exorcists. One account claims Charles underwent more than 30 exorcisms during his reign. Priests surrounded him, chanting Latin prayers and demanding the devil depart. Some went further, claiming his semen had turned to dust, proof that no heir could be born. They weren't entirely wrong. Charles married twice, but sired no children, something the Spanish succession desperately needed. As the Habsburg line burned out, the panic increased. Because Charles wasn't just failing physically, he was failing symbolically. His body became a reflection of the Spanish Empire, crippled, bloated, and unable to reproduce its former glory. Meanwhile, the other European powers circled like sharks. France, Austria, and England all understood what was coming: a succession crisis. The Habsburg bloodline was reaching its final page, and whoever controlled Spain next would control much of Europe. The war had already begun, just not on paper. Charles, to his credit, was aware something was wrong. In the last years of his life, he began to unravel spiritually. He demanded his own ancestors be dug up and exorcised. He suspected poison in his food, witchcraft in his court, betrayal in every direction. It was a tragic paranoia exacerbated by illness, perhaps, but it also rang with a twisted truth. He was the last of his line, and the world was watching him fall apart. When he died in 1700, at the age of 38, the autopsy was horrifying even by 18th century standards. The court physician claimed Charles's body contained no blood, only black bile, that his intestines were rotted, his brain decomposed, and his heart the size of a peppercorn. Whether these details were factual, exaggerated, or politically useful is still debated, but they fed the myth. Charles hadn't died, he had decayed out of existence. His death launched the War of the Spanish Succession, a 13-year European bloodbath that killed over 1 million people. Empires shifted, borders bled, and from the ashes rose a new dynasty. The Bourbons, ushering in a new era for Spain, but one haunted by the long shadow of Charles II's legacy. So was he truly cursed? Medically, the answer is simpler. He was the unfortunate byproduct of generations of inbreeding, with a coefficient of relatedness so high it could have made a geneticist cry. But curses don't need to be supernatural to work. Sometimes they just need to look like inevitability. In the end, El Hechizado became a symbol of decline so perfect it couldn't be invented. His story merged biology, theology, superstition, and imperial hubris into one collapsing frame. And for those who believed in curses, Charles II wasn't just a king, he was a warning in human form. But not all curses cling to the throne. Some seep into the land itself. Some haunt stones and sand. And in a crumbling Indian fortress, buried under desert silence, the echo of a sorcerer's last words still shapes a royal ruin that no one dares to rebuild. Princess Ratnavati and Bangar. Tucked away on the edge of the Aravalli Hills, in the sun-scorched state of Rajasthan, lies the silent shell of a city that refuses to come back to life. Bangar, a 17th century fortress town built for royals, priests, and merchants, once bustled with music, trade, and sandstone grandeur. But today, it stands empty, not ruined by war, not undone by drought, just abandoned. Completely. The walls still stand, the temples still echo, the gates still arch like they're waiting for someone to return. But no one does. Because in Bangar, something is missing, and everyone agrees on what it is. Hope. And everyone agrees on what caused it. A curse. The legend begins with a woman named Princess Ratnavati, the daughter of Shatter Singh, ruler of Bangar in the early 1602. She was, by all accounts, beautiful. Not just royal beautiful, but mythically so. Poets sang about her. Painters couldn't quite capture her. Suitors arrived from every corner of India, bringing gold, tigers, and war elephants, anything for her hand. But Ratnavati was also known for something even rarer than beauty: discernment. She was sharp, educated, unimpressed by grandeur, and, crucially, uninterested in the man who would curse her name for centuries to come. That man was Singya, a tantric, a practitioner of black magic who lived near the edge of the kingdom. He was powerful, feared, and, most importantly, obsessed. He believed that if he couldn't have Ratnavati willingly, he could have her by force of spell. According to the most widely told version of the legend, Singya waited until one of Ratnavati's maids went to the market to buy scented oil, a cosmetic the princess used daily. He enchanted the bottle, infusing it with a love spell so potent it would make her surrender to him instantly. His plan was dark, deranged, and precise, but he underestimated her. When Ratnavati received the bottle, she noticed something was off. Some say she saw Singya watching her from the shadows. Others say her intuition warned her. Whatever the reason, she smashed the bottle against a stone, and the spell, now a physical force, turned on him. The stone rolled towards Singya, gathering speed and momentum, eventually crushing him to death. But dying, as it turns out, was not the end of the story. With his final breath, Singya cursed her. He swore that Ratnavati would never marry, that Bangar would fall, that the entire kingdom would be wiped from memory, consumed by silence and ruin. A dying tantric's fury, thrown like a shadow across the centuries. Soon after, according to legend, Ratnavati did die, some say in battle, others in a palace collapse. What followed was a chain reaction. A war broke out. The kingdom fell. The fort was attacked, looted, and left to rot. The city emptied. Families fled. No one stayed behind. The air changed. And Bangar was never repopulated. That's not poetic exaggeration. It's a recorded fact. To this day, the Archaeological Survey of India has placed a sign at the entrance of Bangar. Entering the borders of Bangar before sunrise and after sunset is strictly prohibited. No camping, no overnight stays, no exceptions. The official explanation is safety wild animals, unstable structures, terrain hazards, but no one believes that's the full story. Not really. Because the site isn't just dead, it's eerily preserved. The markets still have vendor stalls. The temples still hold altars. The royal palace, though collapsed in parts, still looks like it might host a festival if only anyone dared to light the lamps. Guides walk visitors through the ruins during the day, recounting the story of Ratnavati and Singya with the well-practiced rhythm of folklore. But they leave early. Always. There are stories of those who stayed overnight, phones failing, voices in the dark, dreams of falling stones. Some say they saw a woman in a silk sari, standing alone on the parapet, just before dawn. Others heard music echoing from the temple's music with no musicians. Historians, as always, offer more grounded theories: earthquakes, trade route collapse, Mughal invasions, perhaps even plague. But they can't quite explain why, in a land where towns rebuild constantly, no one has ever rebuilt Bangar. Even nearby villagers live at a polite distance, close enough to run a tea stall, far enough to sleep at night. And Princess Ratnavati? She remains a paradox. A woman who defied a spell, but couldn't escape its consequences. A name remembered not for how she lived, but for what her death destroyed. In another version of the story, her soul is said to have been reborn nearby, destined to one day return and lift the curse, but so far the silence has held. Maybe the real curse of Bangar isn't ghosts or spells or tantric rage. Maybe it's the unsettling precision of it all. One ruined love, one ruined kingdom, one moment of defiance that toppled a future. And maybe, just maybe, that's how all royal curses work. Not with thunder or spectacle, but with a whisper, a wronged heart, and a quiet place where no one dares to sleep.